Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So you have to work with me here. Those of you who have not heard me speak before may not recognize that this is not my real voice. It's the voice I have today. It's better than the voice I had yesterday. So I'm not going to get too close to this mic, so don't worry. But I want to thank everybody and for being here today and welcome you to this symposium. And this e-cigarettes are just an issue of such importance, but also of such change. Driving around through my neighborhood on Saturday with my wife, there were all these stores, and she said, "What are these stores?" It's like the V store, or and they're all vaping stores or e-cigarettes. This is an area that seems to me is moving so quickly, being driven by profit, that we really have to play catch up to figure out what is rational policy and public health policy, because we're being beaten by our capitalist, human nature, I guess. So I was really happy to see that this symposium is happening and that speakers are coming today, and I want to thank you all. But my job is not to introduce anybody other than David Holtgrave, who is responsible for the symposium, along with I can't even introduce you, but along with our Institute for Global Tobacco Control. And it's going to cover a broad range of topics that are important as we set the evidence-based, the agenda for the research that we need to do about e-cigarettes. So let me limit the frog imitation as much as possible and tell you about David Holtgrave. Again, probably I don't need to. Everybody knows David, but David's been chair of the department and the inaugural chair of the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society since August 2005, and he holds joint appointments in the School of Medicine and Nursing, and is really a citizen of the university. He's worked extensively in the field of HIV prevention since 1991 and was at the CDC in HIV prevention from 91 to 95. And then from 95 to 97, he was associate professor and associate center director at the Center for AIDS Intervention Research at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and then came back to the CDC in 97. His research is focused on the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of a variety of HIV interventions, and the relation of these findings to HIV prevention policy making. That's a very limited statement, because if you read David's work and his CV, he actually has an incredible intellectual curiosity in a whole variety of things, especially in taking evidence, looking at cost benefit, and then moving from evidence to policy. So not just HIV, but he's most well known for HIV, and one evidence of that is that he's vice chair of the PACHA, the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS, and he's provided testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives during Representative Waxman's hearings on domestic HIV prevention. He got his PhD in quantitative psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and then completed a postdoc in public health and public policy in the interdisciplinary programs in health at the Harvard University School of Public Health. He's co-authored or authored more than 200 publications and has edited the Handbook of the Economic Evaluation for HIV Prevention Programs. So please join me in thanking David and welcoming him to the program.
Thank you so much, Dean Klag, for that wonderful introduction. And also, thank you, Dean Klag, for all of your support of the Institute of Global Tobacco Control and the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society over the years. It's great to get a chance to work in partnership with you. And also, thanks, Dean Klag is not a smoker, of course, but thanks for your invitation about long-term smoking use might sound like, perhaps, over the years. I also wanted to just take a moment to thank a few other partners who made this event possible today. Deborah Roeder, Dave Abrams, and Joanna Cohen very much were our program committee and thought a lot about the issue of what's the topic that was maybe most impactful that we could have a seminar on and how to address that. And that came to the topic of e-cigarettes. Also, I really wanted to thank Andrea, Chris, and Virginia and Health, Behavior, and Society for helping us organize this event, and really underscore sincere thanks to the External Affairs Group, Morgan, Jimmy Liu, Allison, Ricky Fine, and others who worked in really close partnership between the school, External Affairs and Alumni Relations, and HBS to make this happen. So we really appreciate that very, very much. And I wanted to thank all of you for making time to come today. We have faculty, students, and staff in the room. We're expecting a little bit later Dr. Margaret Bright, who was one of the initial faculty members in behavioral and social science in the school some years ago, so we'll welcome Margaret when she is here. We have a number of alumni who graduated from HBS, or its precursor when it was a division in health policy and management, and also some of the partners from the Bloomberg Bloomberg Global Tobacco Reduction Program. They were having a meeting this morning about web-based interventions, and some were able to stay and come with us. So it's always great to welcome our Bloomberg partners here as well. And also Colonel Warrington from the U.S. Army Public Health Command. We had a great meeting a couple of weeks ago with Major General Schenko about how the Public Health Command in the military can work more closely with Hopkins, and we're so delighted that the Colonel was able to join us today as well. And I won't take too much time to introduce my friends and colleagues, the speakers today, Dave Abrams, Ryan Kennedy, Kate Smith, Carl Latkin, and Joanna Cohen. Their bios are all in your program, but I just wanted to say that we're so delighted that all of them are on the faculty here. I think in this area of tobacco use in public health and e-cigarettes in particular, we really have some amazing thought leaders here, and feel very fortunate that day in and day out we get to work with Dave, Ryan, Kate, Carl, and Joanna as the director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control. And I think today is such a the timing is so great. The MMWR, of course, as you know, always drops on Friday. And CDC today in the MMWR talked about how 2/3 of the causes of all death in the U.S. Are from 5 diseases, and of those, 1/3 are very easily preventable. The first major cause of death, diseases of the heart. The first modifiable risk factor, tobacco use. The second highest cause of death, cancer. The first modifiable risk factor, tobacco use. The third major cause of death, chronic lower respiratory disease. First modifiable factor, tobacco use. Fourth leading cause of death, cerebral vascular disease. The fifth modifiable factor they list is tobacco use, but the first couple, like high blood pressure and heart disease, are malleable through reduction in tobacco use. And the last one is unintentional injury. And of course, we all know that there are deaths due to fires related to cigarettes and others, but it didn't quite make their top 10 list of contributing modifiable factors. Nevertheless, I think it's just yet one more testimony to the importance that reduction in tobacco use plays in us trying to move mortality curves in the United States and around the globe. And when we think about doing that, this topic of e-cigarettes, as Dean Klag said, is so central. There's corporate influences, there's health disparities, there's issues of data availability or not, and great debates of whether it's a helpful off-ramp for smokers or a dangerous on-ramp for people who've not yet smoked. And it's really a tremendous opportunity now to hear from people who've been working in this area day in and day out. And so it's my great pleasure to turn the podium over to Dr. Dave Abrams, the director of the Schroeder Research Institute at Legacy and professor in HBS. Dave, turn it over.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this for a couple of weeks now. And of course, deeming regulations were just issued, so that begins to change the landscape, and I'll try to touch a little bit on that towards the end of my presentation. Like Gall and Caesar, this talk is divided into 3 parts. The first is a little bit of history, the second is focused on the specifics of e-cigarettes, and then the last part is trying to bring together what I regard as very complex systems issues on how to thread a needle. And actually, as a colleague of mine said, thread a moving needle, because the data are changing as we go. And we have to thread the needle between doing public health good or doing public health harm. And I don't remember in the last 50 or 60 years a new innovation like e-cigarettes that stirred up so much emotion, so much concern, as well as thoughts about opportunity that we just haven't had in tobacco control, at least not in my living memory. So by way of disclosures, I have almost none except funded by NIH and FDA and the Legacy Foundation. Why are we here? This is global. We're talking about projecting 1 billion preventable deaths. And the recent 50th anniversary Surgeon General's report gives us real pause for concern. For the first time in the Surgeon General's reports, they really flagged the combusting, the burning of the tobacco as the single most overwhelming cause of the death, disease, and preventable disability that comes from tobacco. So in effect, for the first time, I think the Surgeon General is talking about essentially a continuum of toxins and harm, and maybe even arguing, as they have in some of their reports, for the very first time, that making combustible products less appealing, less attractive, and more expensive could be part of a harm reduction strategy that requires shifting people who cannot quit or will not quit or enjoy their nicotine too much to less harmful forms of getting nicotine. So from a public health perspective, this puts us front and center with all the other debates that have happened over harm reduction. And they've been many, and often there's vociferous objection to a harm reduction versus total abstinence approach, whether it's needle sharing for heroin addicts and clean needles, whether it's condom use for adolescents to prevent STDs and HIV, whether it's methadone maintenance for heroin addicts. There was huge opposition to this. And I think over the years, almost every one of those, if not every one of them, has turned out to be wrong, and that harm reduction has saved lives, and in fact moved quite a few people to total abstinence, not just harm reduction. So what's the big take-homes here historically? In the last 50 years, while we've made enormous progress, we have to remember that the Surgeon General says it's worse than we thought. There are more diseases caused largely by combusting or the burning of tobacco products. And while we have some things in the works, youth and adult media campaigns, all of the policy trifecta that we've put in place and need to enforce more, tax disincentives, there's a proposal in the president's budget for another 94-cent tax hike in cigarettes. I'm not sure it'll make it. And of course, the big issue, vulnerable groups. Health disparities is probably the single biggest unaddressed challenge that we have in making additional progress. But overall, progress has slowed to a trickle in the last few years, and people are saying we need to look for something new and different. So let's just step back a little bit to some history. If you take a 100-plus year lens, you can see the rise and fall of the combusted cigarette in the last 100 years. And you'll note that we've made huge progress from the 1960 first Surgeon General's report of Luther Terry to the present time, but we still have over 40 million smokers, probably more like 50 million if you look at non-daily smokers, and it's still the leading preventable cause of death and disability in our country. But how did this all start? The first breakthrough technology was 1881, when a 19-year-old invented the cigarette rolling machine. And this is a wooden rope and paper cigarette rolling machine. I'm kind of fascinated by this. It's pretty cool, actually. And it actually worked, believe it or not. And in fact, if you look at the patterns of cigarette use, between 1880 and 1910, the predominant way of getting tobacco and getting nicotine to your brain was non-combustible products. And they were pretty awful back then, but people used them for 30 or 40 years quite happily, until the disruptive technology of the rolling machine and all sorts of entrepreneurial profit-making led to this huge increase in combusted cigarettes, sales, marketing, distribution, cost, and so on, and a much more highly addictive product. The Surgeon General, in fact, says that even in the last 5 to 6 years, there's evidence that the tobacco industry has refined the ingredients in cigarettes to make them more appealing, more satisfying, and more addictive than ever. But we'll come back to this at the end. I call this the Back to the Future slide. Because if you look at e-cigarettes as a non-combustible and much more appealing form of tobacco, one could surmise that could we get back to 1880 in, let's say, 2025? And could we use this to accelerate, rather than slow to a trickle, the obsolescence of the most damaging behavior, which is the burning of tobacco leaves in all its forms, but primarily cigarettes? But I would not discount little cigars and cigarillos, and particularly hookah among young people. It's dramatically on the rise, and far more of concern, frankly, than the rise of e-cigarettes, although there's a lot of balancing we have to do here on the perils and the promise of e-cigarettes. So here's another little interesting historical fact. In 1930 and prior, stomach cancer was the leading cause of death by cancer, and as you can see from the red line, lung cancer was one of the rarest forms of cancer. And that is at 1930, which is essentially you had quite a lot of combusted tobacco use disseminating into the population. So of course there's the 20 or 30 year lag time from exposure to disease with respect to combusted cigarettes. But this is very instructive. Does anybody know what the single biggest other innovation was that led to this dramatic switch from lung cancer going up in 80 years and stomach cancer going to the lowest in roughly the same period of time? Some people have heard me say this before, so you're not allowed to guess.
I was going to guess refrigeration.
Absolutely. So interestingly, the second disruptive technology that has made a major impact on public health was the invention of the refrigerator, and more importantly, its mass production. And again, it took 40 or 50 years to get it from the beginning to a more popular brand. And by the way, back then, if you think about analogies to e-cigarettes, to me it's very interesting that the early refrigerators around 1920 used very dangerous chemicals. Some of them blew up in people's kitchens, and when you got rid of them, you left them on the street, kids would play in them, the door would lock, and there were many deaths, not many, but certainly a few deaths of kids playing inside abandoned refrigerators. So no technology is perfect, and it's taken 15, 20, 30 years before this took off, and then another 50 years to perfect it into the modern refrigerator that we have today. So technologies innovate and get better and better over a fairly long period of time, and my point is that e-cigarettes are in first and second generation. They really haven't started getting to what might be a very effective alternative form of nicotine delivery with both the promise and the peril that holds. So here's really the bottom line. Everything we do, we're still not going to even get to the 2010 US Public Health Service goal of 12% population tobacco prevalence by 2020 or even 2030, even if we do everything that California's doing, which is usually more than most of the other states in America. So things have slowed to a trickle, and historically, let's just keep in mind some of these 100-year histories. Now, of course, I'm going to pay not just lip service, but I really do believe that this is a systems issue, and while I'll be focusing on only some pieces of the system, to fully maximize the public health benefit, one really needs the integrative and careful looking at both short and long-term feedback loops and multiple pathways that drive use, patterns of use, exposure to harm, and population prevalence. And it's really not as simple as some people might wish. So I don't think you can focus just on youth uptake and ignore adults, nor could you do the converse. And so we have to thread this needle very carefully as it's moving and as the data are coming in to promulgate prudent health policy in this very challenging, and I would argue disruptive, revolutionary, and game-changing environment that we're living in right now in terms of e-cigarettes. So here are some of the tools that I want to talk about. The FDA Act, the Tobacco Control Act. What's really interesting here and very relevant, oops, I think I'm leaning on something. I think I just screwed it up. Basically, the big change in the public health standard from the FDA is that we not only have to look at safety and efficacy of the product at an individual basis, which is usually what one does in a lot of regulatory contexts, but for the first time they've talked about looking at the impact and the harms and benefits on the population as a whole. That means users and non-users, and the users and non-users, and especially youth uptake. So clearly there's a systems model here that has to be taken into consideration. Okay, we're back on track.
Yeah.
So the other challenge is that FDA is not monolithic. And unfortunately, there's been a split in the FDA on prudent nicotine tobacco regulation. Prior to the act, therapeutic nicotine for treatment and smoking cessation was the only way you could get nicotine on the market, and it was done through CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. But the Sotera lawsuit, where FDA tried to exercise its authority, saying that e-cigarettes were a drug delivery device, was overruled by the courts, and they were classified as a tobacco product because the nicotine is made from organic tobacco material. There's actually a little interesting aside here. I've heard recently that some companies are looking at whether they could mass refine nicotine from tomatoes, potatoes, and eggplant, where there are small amounts, in which case it would not be a tobacco product and would perhaps be exempt from all the regulations we've been obsessing about trying to promulgate over the last few years. So even that to me is very interesting. I don't think it's going to be commercially viable, but innovation, and you never know. So this creates a bit of a dilemma. We do not have an overall integrative systems view of how to regulate nicotine and tobacco. And I'll give you some examples later, but the most concerning example here is that if somebody wants to make a claim that an e-cigarette can be used as a harm reduction aid instead of smoking, but not to quit using nicotine, they'd have to go through CTP and file a modified risk tobacco product claim and get it approved and get FDA's CTP to say, you may now sell this and make a claim that it's a significantly reduced harm product compared to a combusted cigarette. The guidelines and criteria for that haven't been fully developed or articulated. It's going to be very interesting to see that tested. However, if you want to claim that it could be used for cessation, you've got to jump all the hoops at CDER, and they are significant, as they are for any pharmaceutical therapeutic aid. And that could take years or be almost impossible to do, except for the big tobacco companies that have the kind of money to do it. And one would guess they don't want to do it because it would unnecessarily cannibalize and speed up the demise of their most profitable, most addictive, and most satisfying product, the combusted cigarette. So this is the kind of world we're in. And if you step back another level, you really have to look at a public health view of this, which is, on the left-hand side, what are all the forces promoting use of more harmful, or at least significantly harmful, tobacco nicotine products? What are the forces countering that at every level? Policy, state, federal, regulation, taxes, advocacy groups, education. And how ultimately do they play to changing the initiation rate, the smoking prevalence rate, the cessation rate, and the relapse rate? And really, this summarizes the public health standard. Obviously, what you want to do is reduce all of the exposures at the net population level to minimize the death, disease, and disability burden of the total population pattern. All right, so part 2 of the talk. Along comes e-cigarettes. So here's the third disruptive technology. In 1963, this is the first e-cigarette was patented. And it's progressed a little since then. Really, the breakthrough was Han Lick in China, who developed the commercially viable e-cigarette that you see, some still on the market, first generation, and increasingly more refined and better products are emerging. What is an e-cigarette? So very basically, it has on the left-hand side a battery in a cylinder that could be the size of a cigarette, and we call that cigarette-like e-cigarettes, or much larger and more recently in what we call tank-like e-cigarettes, where the battery is bigger, the coils deliver more heat, and you get a much more efficient release of more nicotine, and therefore it approximates the satisfaction and the nicotine delivery of a cigarette. But the basic ones you see in the convenience stores, the ones that are mostly accessible to kids, are these cigarette-like products that come in 2 varieties. One is a disposable where you can't replace the cartridge that has the nicotine and maybe flavorants and additives in it, or you can replace the cartridge. And if you buy the ones where you can replace the cartridge, the advertisers and marketers claim that you can get the equivalent of 2 packs of cigarettes out of a box of cartridges, so roughly half the price of a cigarette once you invest in the e-cigarette device, the charger, and so on. So pretty soon, it's pretty appealing from an economic point of view, but it's not as satisfying yet as a combusted tobacco product. So it raises this huge stakes, and this is what everybody's excited about. And I think this is very important. Mitch Zeller, who's the head of the FDA, stated very clearly, and this is actually also in the Surgeon General's report, that any harm-reduced product is going to be received better and might work better in the context of reducing the appeal, addiction, liability, and toxicity of the single most important product that kills most of the people, and that's the burning or the combusted cigarette. Within that context, harm reduction makes more sense, but it is a slippery slope, as you'll see in a little bit, because the more appealing and safer you make this, and the more addictive and satisfying you make the alternative product, while not making the combusted cigarette more expensive, harder to get, and less appealing, you're asking for trouble, particularly among youth and young adults, or perhaps even ex-smokers like myself, who still occasionally drool for a bit of nicotine in their brains 30, 40 years after I quit. And yes, occasionally I do experiment only for research purposes with e-cigarettes, as some of my staff know. So here's the big public health question. Can we thread this needle to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms of this disruptive technology as it changes in the marketplace and as all the market forces of big tobacco muscling in, independent e-cigarette companies? I'm not doing anything. Are struggling. There's 250 of them, and we expect huge market consolidation in the smaller companies, and all the other things that it does to changing the landscape. So we really are in a very new era, and I do think a lot of the lessons learned from all of our tobacco research over the last 50 years, some apply, some may not apply anymore. And one of my biggest concerns is that some of the rules that applied and worked so well, and where we're saying let's stay the course because they worked so well, may actually be iatrogenic now and may feed into big tobacco's agenda, which is to sell both products or a poly set of products to the nicotine brain of the future. And they are happy to sell any form of nicotine or tobacco. They want to make money. And the money they make is not necessarily with harm-reduced products, whereas so far some of the independent e-cigarette makers are in the business of putting combustibles out of business, and that's all they want to make money doing. But you could argue they still want to attract kids, although some of them say they do and some of them say they don't. But the bottom line is big tobacco and independent e-cigarette makers are not monolithic, and I don't think you should treat the e-cigarette makers yet as presumed guilty until proven innocent, until they behave badly. And some of them are, and some of them are not, as you'll see in a little bit. So let me go fairly quickly now through some of the facts and figures. These are all backed up by research in the literature, as well as and other things, but they are largely interpretations based on somewhat preliminary evidence in some areas. And I will disclose that I am a harm reduction fan. I'm not a total abstinence person, and so that will reflect a little bit of my ideologic bias, which is towards some optimism for this truly making combusted cigarettes obsolete faster than any other method. Or I think if we don't play it that way, we're going to feed into big tobacco. And exactly what they want is for us to discourage e-cigarette use, scare the public, tell them it doesn't work to quit smoking, tell them it's going to addict another generation of youth, so that they don't use it exclusively and get rid of combustibles, but they dual use, which is exactly what big tobacco wants. And I must say some of my colleagues, I think, are doing exactly that. And I wish we'd all step back and think about the system's complexity here, that something that might have worked 10 years ago may be iatrogenic now, as I said before. So let me just play a couple of clips here, because this will give those of you that maybe haven't seen this. This is actually 101, what is an e-cigarette and why do people love it? And this is the most optimistic presentation. But it raises every single one of the questions that I think we're all asking in one 4-ish minute clip.
The electronic cigarette.
I've never heard of this, never seen this, don't know what that is.
Got a bejeweled bottom.
Hey, wait a minute. What was that?
That I'm freaking y'all
No,
out
wait a
right
minute.
now. Am I gonna get arrested by the PC police?
Wait a minute. What was that?
It's water vapor. I'm
Really?
essentially humidifying the space.
Yeah, but there's nicotine in there?
There is. It's a battery.
Mm-hmm.
This part is a battery that screws into an outlet, and then this is the filter. And this has liquid nicotine in it, so that it heats it up, and you feel like you're smoking, and you get the habit of this.
Right.
You blow out water vapor, so you're not harming anyone around you, and you're not harming yourself.
Now, will it make you dizzy when you take a hit of the nicotine?
Here, try it.
Because I haven't had a. I thought at first it was a dog whistle. I just take a regular. No, I'm not going to take a big one.
Okay. That's what she said. Oh, man, are we getting in trouble for this? You're awfully good with that. They have cigar-flavored ones.
This is remarkable.
I know.
How long have you had these? How long have they been on the market?
I think they've been around for a while, but I just started using it about 4 months ago.
This ought to get it done, my friend.
I know. You have no excuse now to smoke a real
No,
cigarette. You
that's
really
right.
don't.
Yeah, and is nicotine in and of itself bad for you?
I don't know. I've read things that say it's really not, that it's about as bad for you as a cup of coffee, like it's a stimulant, like caffeine.
Right.
I'm choosing to believe that.
But it's all the... there's something like 30 different carcinogenic chemicals in cigarette tobacco. It's crazy,
Right,
isn't it?
it's the lighting it and inhaling it. It's all the tar, and that's bad for you. It's bad for people around you. So this is saving my day.
This is very cool. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow.
Thank you. I am not promoting smoking. You're gonna get me in trouble. You always get me in trouble.
Now, is there a chance you become addicted to the device?
Oh yeah, I'm totally addicted to the device. But it's not bad for you.
Oh, I see.
So it's a fun addiction.
Yeah.
You know?
Wow. Now, who makes the damn thing? Where do you get those?
This one's called a smoke stick.
Yeah, I'm dizzy. I'm actually dizzy.
Are you?
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No.
Are you gonna be
I'm
able to
great.
conduct the
No,
rest
I'm
of this
fine.
interview?
Oh yeah, everything will be fine. No. There'd be no telling that I'm dizzy tonight. I'm just stunned by that. Well, you got a daughter and stuff. You can't be doing that.
Really? No, I know. My mother's already given me a pretty
So,
hard time about
you
it.
inhale when you do that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Wait, which one are we going with? What?
See, I deliberately didn't inhale because I didn't want to vomit.
But it doesn't really taste like. Well, this is menthol, but it doesn't really taste like anything. They have strawberry, chocolate
Yeah,
flavors.
but if you get it in your lungs, it goes right to your bloodstream and you might vomit.
Really?
Well, I'm speaking for myself.
Personally, right. I've got a pretty high tolerance at this point.
I feel kind of loopy now.
Because it wasn't nicotine in that stick, Dave.
No, look out. Hang on. Hello. Call the FDA. Well, and then eventually you wean yourself off and you're just fine.
Yeah, well, that's the idea. That's
Okay,
the
we'll
idea.
be right back maybe, everybody.
When was that, David?
About 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. It says it all. I could probably just stop my talk here. The benefit and the peril is right there. It stirred up a lot because of what you see. And note, first time in television that you've seen someone looking like they're smoking in 40 years, 40 plus years. What does that do to families watching TV? Frankly, we don't know, but it's probably not good for kids in the next generation. So again, let me go fairly quickly, and again, my slides are available, but these are roughly the three different types. If you want a close-up, the tank-like here is the ones that you get in vape shops primarily. You buy these bottles of juice, which has nicotine in various flavors and various concentrations, bigger batteries, more efficient delivery. There's some data that although all of the e-cigarettes I've seen, first and second generation, the human pharmacokinetic studies done to date suggest that the absorption is much slower, and therefore it's probably less addictive in terms of the speed of the hit to the brain. But the more recent big tank-like products, you're getting a fairly decent amount of nicotine, and although it's slower, your peak blood nicotine level is starting to approximate the level of a cigarette. So over time, we don't really know yet if e-cigarettes are addictive as cigarettes, less addictive, so they're a way to wean you off, and then you wean yourself more easily off the e-cigarette. Or for example, if kids start with an e-cigarette and they're not as harsh, and they've got milder taste, which is why 50% of kids like menthol, for example, is it possible that kids would go, you know what, my parents and everybody else that are burning these tobacco products, that's antiquated, that's obsolete, I don't want to do this anymore, and maybe there'll be a gateway for them not progressing to more combusted, more addictive, more lethal, and more defective cigarettes. Or maybe not. And that's, I think, one of the single biggest public health dilemmas. Here are some of the juice boxes and flavors. So bottom line is it's usually nicotine, propylene glycol, glycerin, some flavorings, and the products vary dramatically. Unfortunately, until last week, before FDA began to exercise its deeming authority, you wouldn't know what's in them. There are contaminants in some of the brands. They're imported from overseas where who knows what quality control If any of you read the New York Times, you'd see that my quote of the day was, now you can no longer mix nicotine and a bunch of junk in your bathtub and sell it on the street corner. So regulation should take care of this. Regulation could easily promulgate product standards, tracking systems, registration, which is all in the deeming, in order to ensure that the public get high quality and as healthy as possible or as contaminant-free as possible bottles of juice and cartridges. And when you do that and you get fairly, and by the way, the industry voluntarily is starting to do that too. I wish they'd have done it earlier. And my big criticism of the industry is I don't know how they dare sell a bottle of juice that's not in a childproof container with a warning label on it. I have heard of one death of a kid under 5 in Israel who drank a bottle of juice. Thank heavens most of the people who drink nicotine, it's so aversive that you throw up and it's sort of self-limiting. You get very sick, but it probably won't kill you just because of the fact that it's so emetic to you that you'll throw up and get rid of most of it. But this is horrendous. Anyway, so moving along, as I said, be careful that you don't monolithically lump evil big tobacco, which I do think are guilty until proven innocent, and it's going to take a long time, if ever. If they voluntarily gave up combusted cigarettes and said, you know what, it's a defective product, we could make money without killing people with e-cigarettes and better e-cigarettes, we voluntarily quit making our defective product. If they did that, they wouldn't hopefully be subject to lawsuits like General Motors, where they have a defective ignition and kill 13 people and all hell breaks loose, whereas unfortunately big tobacco can sell a defective product that kills half the people that use it prematurely, and they can do that legally and with no problem. So I do think from a systems point of view, there's something wrong with this picture. The only way we can accelerate this is to discourage and make less appealing combustibles and let people vote not only with their feet but with their pocketbook. If people stop buying combusted cigarettes, I think that's how you drive a wedge, both between big tobacco selling both products and if you inadvertently promote some small industries that are not big tobacco, who are quite happy making money just selling e-cigarettes to adults to help them switch, that may be worth considering, and that's a tough threading your needle because you don't want to demonize all of e-cigarettes, but you still want to worry about a whole bunch of things. So just throwing that out as another food for thought issue around the threading the needle stuff. So let's just move on now. What do we know? I'll give you some brief facts and figures about the industry, product features, advertising and patterns that target youth, consumer perceptions, and then I'll end in the last third of my talk, which is now going to be less than a third, around some of the dilemmas and policy considerations. So again, I'm going to go quickly. There's a whole bunch of non-combustible products now on the left-hand side, and I think we are evolving into a society that will mix and match and be poly-abusers. So if you have abuse liability, which is the appeal and addiction of the nicotine, and toxicity, which causes all the harm, you obviously have combusting products as really off the chart here in terms of both lethality and optimal nicotine addiction because of the way it's delivered when you burn tobacco. And then you really, if you're a total abstinence person, you just want nobody to use nothing. And if they're already addicted to nicotine because of tobacco, you want them to use FDA-approved nicotine replacement therapies as your first line of recommendations for quitting and eventually quitting everything. But FDA now does allow you to use NRT lifetime if necessary to stop you from going back to cigarettes. And so now we have e-cigarettes, probably better next generation e-cigarettes, which I believe are not going to be much more harmful, but are going to be way more satisfying, appealing, and probably more addictive. So that's what's coming. And Swedish snus is actually not a bad alternative as well because of the low nitrosamine. It's not high in toxicity. And if somebody, again, wants to get off combustids, and I'll show you some data from Sweden in a little bit, it's an attractive alternative. American snus actually is quite damaging. It has high nitrosamines. It's got all the pH to absorb nicotine, and you can actually get the highest blood nicotine levels. And high school kids are using this, and when they've been tested coming out of high school, their blood nicotine levels are higher with snus than if they could sneak a few cigarettes in the bathroom, or maybe now smoke a few e-cigarettes because they don't smell very much, and it's much easier to hide them. So again, we're in a totally new ball game here. So the idea is, harm reduction is to get people to zero if you can, but if you can't, different steps of reduced harm. And what you want is to go down from combustids to nothing, or intermediately to nothing, and you don't want the red lines, which is the youth uptake or former smokers starting to use and eventually relapsing back to combustids, because after all, right now, they're still the most appealing, most addictive, and most chemosensory satisfying product on the market. So let's go very quickly through some of this. I keep saying quickly, and then I don't go very quickly, but some of the data that's analyzed good quality e-cigarettes, I believe, shows that the nitrosamine levels, for example, are roughly similar to nicotine replacement therapy, because you've got to have some low level, because all of them get their nicotine from organic tobacco leaves. And look, it's way less than Swedish snus, which is in turn dramatically 3 orders of magnitude roughly less than Marlboro Ultra-Right or Red. So there's no question here that e-cigarettes are much closer to unregulated nicotine replacement therapy, at least in their harm profile of some of these chemicals. And we do know this now. I think it's very inaccurate for people to say, we don't really have the data, we don't know if they're less harmful than cigarettes, we'll have to wait and see. I think that feeds big tobacco's dual-use agenda more than anything else, is to not tell the public that these are reduced harm products. And in fact, they're not allowed to tell the public using FDA regulations until they go through that modified risk status. Some of the other chemicals of concern, and by the way, e-cigarettes have a handful of chemicals versus 7,000 in combusting cigarettes. So it's not only the number, but the levels. They tend to be less on almost every level, and some, 10 to 100 to 1,000 times less. So I don't think there's any debate that they're less harmful, at least on these acute biomarkers. What we don't know is long-term use of propylene glycol. But I've talked to toxicologists, and given what we know about propylene glycol, that it does cause local tissue irritation. So some people will have itchy eyes, including bystanders, and itchy throats, and perhaps temporary lung inflammation. They think it's highly unlikely that it'll ever come close to inhaling the carbon monoxide and 7,000 other particulate and gas phase chemicals in cigarettes. But we really don't know the long-term effects of an e-cigarette. Primarily, the short-term biomarkers look promising. Also, they don't deliver nicotine very well, especially the cigarette-like ones that I referred to earlier. And they might actually get better. I think we're starting to see second and third generation. People say that the Reynolds Views is pretty much going to be much better than the others. And I know Philip Morris has at least 3 in the pipeline that are pretty good. But if you're big tobacco, you'd only bring them out when you have to beat the competition. So that's why you need independents to make better e-cigarettes, to force big tobacco to trump them. So I think that's really important to keep the competition going. Side stream smoke, much less than in cigarettes, but I do believe even a small amount of nicotine and particulate matter in side stream smoke probably warrants that no bystander should be forced to breathe it in. And we do know that even low levels of nicotine will stick on furniture, So even though here the particulate matter is actually very close to the WHO standard for acceptable air quality, which is 40, and cigarettes after 1.5 or 3 minutes are way off the scale compared to e-cigarettes after 3 minutes, I think you can make a case that you should ban e-cigarettes in clean indoor air and outdoors for various reasons, including health. Although some have argued that that makes it harder for the smoker to quit, get used to them, enjoy them, and maybe eventually get off combustibles. But I think that's a small price to pay. So summary, they vary dramatically, as I said. Nicotine dose varies from almost nothing to fairly efficient. The propylene glycol is a local irritant, secondhand vapor, way less. Some of it non-detectable, but sufficient to be of concern, at least even at low levels of nicotine. For example, we know nicotine is a teratogen, and any pregnant mom doesn't want to breathe it in. So I think that's a single enough good reason to have clean indoor air laws for e-cigarettes. So let's just move on quickly. Dramatic increases among adults, dramatic increases among high school kids, and this is getting people very worked up, and I think they're misreading the data. This may well be a canary in the mine, but at the moment I don't think so, and this is why. This is the doubling of e-cigarette use among middle and high school kids that Tom Frieden at CDC and others are literally screaming from the treetops. Apparently he did that today or yesterday in Los Angeles. And I agree, no nicotine, tobacco, e-cigarettes, or anything else in any shape or form should be marketed, sold, targeted, or allowed to be purchased by people under 18. And I think we should enforce all of those laws either as well or better than we've done for cigarettes. But 6 million kids are still going to start smoking and die despite our best efforts, and we shouldn't get too bent out of shape that some kids are going to try these products. The key question is, are more kids than otherwise would ever have started using cigarettes over and above going to be attracted to try them, and then the nicotine is going to get them to want to try a better nicotine delivery system, which at the moment is the combustible cigarette. And that's the gateway into smoking that I agree we should be watching carefully and being very vigilant about. But as I said, it's equally plausible if you told kids, you're stupid to follow your parents and get onto combustibles. This is like your, what's that new electric car in California? Tesla. You know, we don't burn tobacco anymore. We don't have combustion engines anymore. This is like the horse and buggy and the lead gasoline engine. This is a disruptive technology. And here's the reassuring data. If you look at the exact same period, the last 3 or 4 years, this is the monitoring the future data on 50,000 adolescents. There is absolutely no change in the 10% per year reduction in combusted cigarette use. So I'm seeing no canary here that e-cigarettes are promoting a proportionately greater number of kids than otherwise would be smoking anyway. And if anything, it's still coming down just the way we want it to. And so here's a better way, I think, of drawing that same graph that I have here. And that is as follows. E-cigarette use has doubled like that. But it's in the context of cigarette use being at record lows over the last 50 years. And if I have time, which I probably don't because I'm wanting to end fairly soon, Swedish snus data looks exactly like this, and people had the exact same fears. And in fact, they have 50 years of data that those fears of harm reduction, of bridge product, of addiction, none of them came true. Sweden is a huge success story. Would be even better if they had e-cigarettes instead of snus. But it's a really good example of harm reduction working. And every one of the fears that people have about harm reduction has not been proven true in Sweden. It's now happening in Norway, so people can say, oh, it's Swedish culture and it's unique and it can't apply to the rest of the world. So let me just speed up here. Here's the problem. The problem is really big tobacco's dual use and promotion. We are seeing a playbook like the 50s and 60s where big tobacco is using all its tricks on TV, appealing to kids and young adults, undermining indoor air laws, and promoting dual use. Why quit? Switch. Dual use. Cartoon characters, the usual attractive, selling sex. I did not put the Sports Illustrated one in here, but I have it if anybody wants to look at it. It's pretty disrespectful, and it's almost pornographic. I can't believe that. Am I supposed to get off in about 5 minutes? Or? Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'll try to do that. Okay, yeah, but I want Q&A. So people use them for all the reasons you'd expect. People are not stupid. The public aren't stupid. They know they're less harmful. They're helping them reduce harm. They want them to help them quit smoking. In fact, we are seeing that heavier smokers and smokers who are having more difficulty quitting are tending to try to use e-cigarettes. I think several observational studies have erroneously concluded, therefore, that they don't help you quit smoking. I disagree. I think these are the toughest smokers who are struggling to quit. And of course, it's not helping them as much, relatively speaking. But I do believe people who are trying e-cigarettes are more conscious of harm reduction and are more desperate to find some way to help them quit. The direction of an association can be in either direction. I think some of the ideologic biases are pushing people to look at observational studies and say, oops, the sky is falling, e-cigarettes are terrible, they don't help you quit. I think that is methodologically stats 101. Everybody should know that association cannot be confused with causation, and particularly not in one direction. So I'll stop there to, just in the interests of time, to criticize some of those observational studies and the news that you're hearing, that they not only don't help you quit, they may undermine your quitting. The two studies, randomized trials, do show promise. The one I'm most particular about is the Bullen study from New Zealand, a fairly large N study, although we need more and we need replication. But what people didn't realize is that at 6-month follow-up, 7-day point prevalence, which is the bottom line here, e-cigarettes have a 21% quit rate compared to 16% for NRT, which is very comparable to all the meta-analysis studies in the PHS guideline. And basically, I think you can say, although this is preliminary and we need more studies, e-cigarettes can help you quit just as well as NRT. And if way more people use them, from a public health standard, reach and impact would be way higher. And remember Jeff Rose's theorem that a small effect on a large number of people can have huge public health significance. Just accelerating quitting in 40 million people by 2 or 3 more percentage points would have huge public health benefit, despite what everybody says. In the UK, where they track things very rapidly, e-cigarettes have surpassed NRT and other medication treatments for use as a cessation aid. The Royal College of Physicians talked about Sweden. Let me just quickly say, these are the 4 myths that 45 years ago the Swedish people were worried about in introducing low nitrosamine Swedish snus. As I said, not one of them were proved true. The most, basically, as snus went up, combusted went down. It didn't slow or lead to dual use as a bridge product. This is the most really interesting slide of all. Just take a look at this. This is snus use, doubling every year in 4 decades of cohorts. Okay? And not once did it undermine youth uptake. In fact, it's pushing down combusted use, whether they started smoking with snus, started using snus first and then smoked, or started later snus use. All of the myths and fears that Tom Frieden is shouting from the desk, from the rooftops, are not borne out either by our data or by the Swedish data over 4 decades of prospective studies. And so I think our data looks kind of like the first step in these data. The yellow is getting bigger, but the red is getting smaller. Same thing. All right, enough, point made. For cessation as well, Swedish snus is being used more than NRT or any other product to help Swedish people quit. And they have the lowest cancer rates, and interestingly, they have the lowest oral cancer rates because the low nitrosamine snus, they actually have lower oral cancer rates in Sweden than in the USA, which is pretty amazing. So harm reduction can work. What about policies and regulation? We've got a lot of dilemmas here and tools. Product standards to ensure quality. They can submit claims for modified risk. I hope FDA does this expeditiously with good responsibility. As I said, it's the Goldilocks approach. Regulation should be not too restrictive and not too laissez-faire, not too hot and not too cold. But if we can get through some of the e-cigarette to be approved by the FDA as a harm reduction product so we can tell the public to switch completely with assurance that it's safer than a cigarette. That's, I think, the biggest opportunity we have. And to the degree that we say the research is out there, we don't know. Nicotine is just as bad as burning tobacco. You don't want to addict the next generation. I do think we're going on the side of an extremism that may be counter to public health. On the other hand, if I'm wrong and they're right, it could go the other way. And I'm not saying we really know because we've got very preliminary data. However, I would say that the more doubt you cause now and the more knee-jerk responses of what they call the precautionary principle of when in doubt, restrict and do this. Somebody said what you're doing is preventing the ability for a preventive intervention to do its work. So be very careful that ultra-conservatism here may be counterproductive in this context. So back to the future, to conclude, maybe we're okay with lots of e-cigarette use because we'll start looking like 1880 with the population who really loves their nicotine and is not going to do without it and wants it. Can have it, but in a clean form. And actually, Neil Benowitz published an article that you should even get your marijuana this way because it's way less harmful now than burning a joint. So it's actually ironic that smoking a joint is going to be more harmful than using an e-cigarette. And we're legalizing for recreational use marijuana, whether we like it or not, whether we're for it or against it. The toothpaste is out of the tube here, and we've got to deal with this new world of recreational use. And how do we manage that prudently with regulation, policy, education of kids and adults, just like we do with risky sex and everything else? Let's not be extremism about this because we're so scared of the unknowns of this disruptive technology. Think about the disruptive technologies of the last 100 years. Stomach cancer and the refrigerator. Almost no public health intervention at all, just a commercial product, period. And we wiped out stomach cancer with no regulation other than safety standards so that refrigerators didn't blow up in your kitchen, and safety latches so you could get out of them if your kids started playing in them or took the doors off. I remember my parents taking the doors off their fridge. So public education. So here's my, if I can just do it, this is the future according to Reynolds Tobacco Company, which I don't necessarily support, but it's kind of scary.
Tomorrow, it's where great things happen. Dreams, opportunities, the promise of new things to come. The question is, how do we get there? Tomorrow needs a spark, something to move us forward. It's time smoking changed forever. Welcome to Views. Views is the first and only digital vapor cigarette. Microprocessor controlled, Views ensures a perfect puff. First time, every time. Designed and assembled in the USA by tobacco experts. We know what smokers want. A truly satisfying taste. Only Views delivers on the promise. Views. Welcome to tomorrow.
To me, this is scary because that's a dual-use ad. We know what smokers want. We know what satisfies them. Use our product over the competition in terms of e-cigarettes because it's better, but also keep in mind you want your satisfaction, and our, Camels or Marlboros are still going to be the best way to do it. And I think they're going to go as slow as they possibly can to promote dual use and avoid cannibalizing their products. And frankly, there's nothing we can do about it. It's almost like you can't beat them, you've got to join them. But join them in a way that you're using what I call the jujitsu move. Use the weight of big tobacco to drive a wedge between their defective and harmful cigarettes and the non-combusted products, and accelerate the demise and obsolescence, force them and force the public to vote with their pocketbook so they just don't buy those junk, defective, lethal cigarettes anymore. So that's sort of the bottom line. I think I'll stop there. I had a whole bunch of policy-related recommendations. The one thing I do want to stop and say is I think the single biggest policy we're ignoring, and that is taxes. We know it works. We know taxes prevent kids from starting better than anything else, and taxes discourage adults as well and make them want to quit. We should have a differential tax equal to the harm proportion of the product. So if you want to tax an e-cigarette, you should add enough tax to a cigarette so that the difference is bigger than it is now. So tax an e-cigarette to prevent kids from starting with e-cigarettes, but double or triple the tax on combustibles to prevent progression and encourage adults to quit. That's a complete public health win for everybody. And people aren't talking about that. They're so distracted about debating the pros and cons of e-cigarettes, which is exactly what big tobacco did 50 years ago. We debated whether it caused cancer for 50 years. And they ran all the way to the bank while we debated amongst ourselves. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. This was an excellent talk. My name is Kiana Brown, and I'm a PhD candidate here in the Department of Mental Health. So my question is about the relationship between e-cigarettes and cancer and other chronic conditions, heart disease, high blood pressure, things of that nature. Is there any strong evidence for or against that association?
As I said, this is intermediate biomarker data, so it's not chronic long-term looking at disease, death, and dollars, but I do think these biomarkers are fairly good markers of long-term. E-cigarettes are dramatically less carcinogenic, if not almost minimally, as you saw from some of my slides. There are small amounts in some of the less quality controlled e-cigarettes, largely of heavy metals, particulate matter, volatile hydrocarbons, but at so much lower levels than cigarettes that if you're thinking about harm reduction, it's no debate. E-cigarettes are way more beneficial if you can't stop everything and you really can't, and NRT isn't working. I'd rather you were on e-cigarettes than go back to smoking cigarettes. With respect to heart disease, we have 20, 30 years of experience with nicotine replacement therapies. So nicotine itself clearly raises blood pressure and heart rate, but by a rather small amount. However, nicotine does change platelet aggregation, fibrinogen levels in the bloodstream, and can promote clotting. So, but this is not e-cigarettes, this is nicotine. It does it whether you're taking NRT or breathing it in an e-cigarette, but again, so minimal in the population compared to combusted cigarettes that I don't care what you do, stop using combustibles. It's way safer for heart disease, all the pulmonary diseases, and cancer. But that's not to say nicotine is benign. As I said, even low doses can cause birth defects in pregnant moms. It does raise blood pressure a little bit. I've seen one study on e-cigarettes. Because the nicotine is delivered inefficiently, it only raised heart rate and blood pressure about 10% of the amount that it's raised with regular cigarettes. So again, safer. And no carbon monoxide, excuse me. No carbon monoxide is a big deal. There's absolutely no carbon monoxide in the vapor of e-cigarettes.
One more question.
Thanks. Bob Vollinger, I'm a DRPH candidate in HPS. And I guess you were making the comparison between cessation rates with traditional tobacco, with ends versus
NRT.
Versus NRT. And I guess the major difference there is that somebody can walk around with a patch and no one knows that they have it or not, right? Whereas if they're walking around smoking or vaping with an electronic cigarette, it's just reinforcing the whole behavior of smoking these things or using these products in public. And I guess we spend a lot of effort trying to change social norms around this behavior. And I guess to me that, kind of voids all those efforts.
That's a good point. To me, though, the jury's out on that, because you see people smoking cigarettes in public, even though we've tried to minimize it in bars, nightclubs, and even in public spaces. If, as you know, households where they're smoking, that's where the kids start smoking. It's either the parents or an older brother or sister or a peer that are the biggest triggers. So I think the incremental effect of people walking around smoking e-cigarettes, and if you restrict it, as I said you should, they won't be able to use them in public places. I'm not convinced that the modeling and the other things are incrementally so damaging as to offset the benefit. But that's a public health question. We really don't know. The jury's out on that. Secondly, I think what's really interesting is if you look at the meta-analyses in the PHS guides on FDA-approved smoking cessation, nicotine gum has a slight edge, as you know, over patch. And we think that's because that's the PRN movement, that you can use it to reduce an urge whenever you can. What I think would be really cool is to do a study of combined patch and e-cigarette, or combined gum and e-cigarette, where you use the gum when you're not allowed to use an e-cigarette so that you don't relapse, but you use the e-cigarette, because I actually also think one of the most powerful treatment elements in the e-cigarette is that you're actually extinguishing the behavioral ritual and all the backward classically conditioned chaining that you get from the hit of nicotine that comes within 7 seconds, because there's much slower nicotine absorption. So the public may not know this, but they're actually weaning themselves off of all the cues that lead them down the path to smoking a cigarette. And I wouldn't be surprised if once we have better randomized trials, that an e-cigarette will beat NRT, because it's a combination of the behavioral ritual that satisfies the person while they're extinguishing the nicotine. Now that will change as e-cigarettes get better and more addictive. They'll actually work better to get you off cigarettes, but they may not work better to get you off e-cigarettes. So to me, that's a second public health issue. I think it's a two-step process, and we shouldn't try to do it all at once, black and white. I think we should first have a strategy to get everybody off combustibles using e-cigarettes, and then worry when combustibles is 3 or 4%. Then worry about, do we titrate down the nicotine level in e-cigarettes so that they're less addictive? To me, that's a 20-year, possibly FDA strategy, because you're never going to get approval without lawsuits of reducing the nicotine in combusted cigarettes, where they're putting $140 million into research that I don't think will ever get through the court systems.